What's going on, guys? Welcome to Rob's house. We're on our way home today and I'm just enjoying the sound of this popping and cracking. Check this out. Oh man. So I figured out the Burble tune. I figured out how to iron it out so that the car still drives well. The way I was doing it before is how you would typically do a Burble tune on a car that does not rely on a heavy amount of torque tuning like these new platforms. So basically, the thing that I was doing wrong before, and I'll show you when we get home, we'll go into HP Tuners and take a look. But basically what happened was, I pulled a bunch of timing, as you saw in the previous video. I'll link in the description to the previous video below. I was pulling a bunch of timing on the deceleration regions, but the problem is I didn't mess with the torque table. So I found out that I actually don't need to mess with the main spark tables. If I have my minimum set low enough, the car will pop, but it wasn't popping like it's popping right now. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to make the pops a lot more violent, a lot more pronounced, and you know, just a lot louder. And basically what you do is you go into your torque management. What you do is you tell the car, hey, you should be making actually more torque, right? And what that'll do, if you adjust all those tables up in those lower regions, you're telling the car that it should be expecting to make more torque, which means that the car will say, well, I don't want to make that much torque because we're on deceleration right now, so I'll pull more timing. So you kind of trick the car into pulling more timing, and then if you have your minimum tables set such that it allows that much timing to be pulled, which when you're hearing these really violent pops, you're running about -10 degrees of timing, you know, you'll get more unburned fuel into the exhaust, and the car will pop like a popcorn machine. From the factory, these cars don't burble at all, and that's because the minimum spark tables are set too high. It doesn't allow the car to pull that much timing. If you take the minimum spark tables down, you can get to the point where your car will run 0 degrees of timing at on deceleration. That will give you some light popping, some light gurgling, but not what you're hearing right now from my car. Now, so in order to go more, some people on the tuning forums were telling me, oh, just pull your minimum sparks even lower. And I'm like, well, I did, but for some reason, like, I can run whatever, I could put -30 degrees of timing in all of those cells in the minimum spark table, and my car still only goes to 0 degrees. Why, right? That's what I was trying to figure out. Why won't it go lower than where it's going right now? And I figured out it's because of the torque management. If you really want to go crazy and you made it even more severe than this, you can have it make like cannon fire, like gunshots, which would be around -15, -20. I don't have my torque table set up to have the car trying to go that low because it's really loud. This is already really loud, so I'm happy with where this is at. And the best part about this is, since you're only messing with the torque management on deceleration conditions, the car drives perfect. It drives totally normally. You're not screwing with anything on acceleration because your intake cam angle is different. I didn't mess with any of those tables. So I'm still making my, you know, 650 wheel horsepower. Car still pulls really hard, still feels great, still breaks the tires loose even with traction control on. Like it's the same car that I know and love. It just pops like crazy on decel now. And I knew there was a way to do this, and it was bothering me because in my previous video, when I had just run negative timing in the main spark tables, I was getting all this jerking. And I think what that was I was running negative timing, which I wanted. The car starts popping, but then the car says, oh, wait, -15 degrees, like that's way less torque than I want to make right now, right? So it was adding time. It was actually preventing me from running that minimum. I'm never gonna get tired of that. It's actually preventing me from running the timing that low, and it was adding timing. But then the main table was telling it, no, 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 go down. So it was going like -10, +10, -10, +10, -10, +10, and the car was just like jerking back and forth like crazy. It was terrible. I mean, it was absolutely miserable to drive the car that way. So you know, anyway, my solution now with torque match. So now my main tables are back to stock, well, or back to my performance tune, right? My car's not stock, but all of that tuning all that tuning happens at the higher air mass when you're actually on the gas. So all of my deceleration tables, we never messed with when we were tuning the car anyway. So that's all back to stock now. The minimums are down to like the -10 range where I want it. And then I just messed with the torque management, and the car will pull timing down to whatever the minimum values are. So this is perfect. On acceleration, it would take a second or two for the cylinder air mass to build up. So you'd actually get a lot of hesitation. So if you're just rolling back onto the gas at about 5% throttle, the car would feel like shit. It was like jerking all over the place. It just didn't drive right. So it doesn't do that now. I can roll, as soon as I roll on, right, torque management stops pulling timing, and I'm like, right now I'm on like 5% of throttle. I'm like barely touching the throttle. Look, no pops, right? Nothing. Totally smooth, totally linear, right? If I put my foot down, no problem. And it's only when I fully let off the gas that it starts to pop. Sorry about that, I just passed the cop. All right, so anyway, when I get home, oh God, it's a lot. That's violence back there. When I get home, we'll fire up HP tuners, and I'll show you guys. I'll show you guys how to make these changes and how to get your car to do this if you have if you're driving a Gen 5 GM car. So I'm gonna finish my drive and put the camera down now, but I'll see you guys at home. All right, guys, we're home. Check it out. I'm gonna walk you guys through torque management settings on my Corvette that achieved a very drivable Burble tune. I'm going to show you guys the concepts behind it so you can apply this to your own vehicle, whether you have a Gen 5 GM vehicle, be it a Camaro or a Corvette or LT1, LT4, doesn't really matter, same concept, or any other type of car that relies on some kind of torque tuning. So in a previous video, I had messed around with the high octane tables, and I was running negative timing in some of those cells. Forget all that. We're not going to do any of that. We're not going to touch these tables at all. Leave them stock. Okay. High octane and low octane under Spark Advance base. These are your main tables. Don't touch them. Okay. Minimum spark base and long term, I have them set to the same thing. If we take a peek in here, right, I had taken pretty much a stock table from a 2018 Z06, and I took the tables from a C6 Corvette in the deceleration range. So you're going to have low air mass on deceleration. My cylinder air mass can get as high as 0.22 on deceleration sometimes. So I lowered the minimum allowed spark up through 0.24. Now, this is the minimum allowed spark. This is not the targeted spark. You're telling the car you are allowed to go down to this value, but you're not necessarily going to. Now, for science, what I did, if you notice, in some of these lower regions here, so 2400 RPMs and down, I'm allowing the car to go down to -5 or even -10 degrees of timing. So firing after top dead center. And I noticed that in my logs, it never seems to go below 0, which would be top dead center. Or sometimes it'll hit like -1, but it's in the ballpark of 0 degrees. It never gets anywhere close to -10. I know from my previous video, in order to achieve the pops and bangs, you need to be realistically, you need to be at like -5 at least, if not -10. If you want street speed 717 burbles, you need to be in the -10 territory. So that said, for science, what I did was, all right, let me try this. Let me take all of these rows and set them to, I think I set them to like -25 or something, hit equals, right? So like this whole table is like, all right, allow tons of timing to be pulled. And I noticed in my logs that still nothing was happening, right? So I'm like, man, what is going on? Let's move over real quick to my log. Move HP tuners out of the way for a second. So here is my log for that tune that I just showed you. Now, mind you, the only thing that I had messed with was minimum spark. Okay. What I noticed, so the way I have this set up is we can see a couple of things. On the side here, we can see the RPM of the car in red here, the speed, the manifold absolute pressure in kPa. We can see the cylinder air mass in grams. So the cylinder air mass here, this 0.14 at the spot that I happen to be in, cylinder air mass is going to correspond in your minimum table. That's what, see the spark air mass? That's your y-axis here, right? So it's important to pay attention to that. And it's also important to pay attention to the manifold absolute pressure. I'll get into that in a little bit. It also shows me how much spark advance there is, and I have my accelerator position. So you guys can see what input I'm giving the car and how the car is responding. Now, also worth noting, intake and exhaust cam angle down here. Intake cam angle is the one that we care about. That is going to change in such a way that if you notice, as I drag here, when I'm not on the gas, it's at 0. When I'm on the gas, all of a sudden, see we're at 18. You know, it's varying, right? Again, off the gas, we're back at 0. All right. Now, with the Burble tune, we obviously only want it to be doing pops and bangs on deceleration, which means that we want to take note of the conditions when we have 0 accelerator pedal, right? When I'm not on the gas at all. So I'm braking, basically, or just coasting. If I move along in here, let's get to, okay. So here I'm actually moving now. So we're doing, let's see. So we're in first gear here. We shift. We're in second gear. Okay, we shift. We're in third gear. All right, we're doing 50 miles an hour now. We're at 2,700 RPMs. Our cylinder air mass is high, right? 0.8, where that's high up in that tail. Manifold absolute pressure is also high at 106. You can see that also in the table on the top right. That's your manifold absolute pressure live table. And then we have 25 degrees of spark. I'm giving it about half throttle, so I'm accelerating a little bit. And then I dump the gas, right? So now we're at 0. So now we see cylinder air mass drops a lot to 0.13. Manifold absolute pressure is also at 21 kPa. Intake cam angle is now at 0. Okay, take note of all of these parameters. Now, if we notice, we can follow this white line and see the car pull spark. Okay, car's pulling spark, pulling spark, pulling spark, pulling spark. We get down to like 2 degrees, right? If we go over here, we get down to maybe 1 degree. If we go over here, same thing. We're on deceleration in all of these ranges, right? Accelerator pedal is at 0. We go over here, accelerator pedal is at 0. We're at top dead center now. Okay, but notice how even if I click through this, all right, now we're at minus 0.4, 0.3, and we're at 1,600 RPMs. So my minimum spark table at 1,600 RPMs with a cylinder air mass, what do we have? 0.12, right? So that's this row. 1,600 RPMs, I'm telling the car you can go down to -9. So why is it only going to 0 or minus 0.5? Here's why. In order to figure out what's going on, we need to understand how torque management works in this car. There's a couple components of torque management, okay? If we go into torque management, we go into driver demand, okay? And we go to our map. This is the table that tells the car, here's, given a certain throttle position and RPM, here's how much torque we're requesting from the car, right? So if we're at 0, we should be losing torque because we're on decel. Now, the virtual torque tables, if we go to edit virtual torque up here, the way these work is for a given spark value and a given, in this case, this is air mass. Okay, so this is in milligrams. The log is in grams. Okay, so 100 would be 0.1. All right, so just divide whatever this number is by 1,000, and that's what you get in the other table. So at 0 degrees of spark, cylinder air mass of 0.1, right? Depending upon the RPM is our x-axis. This is how much torque we should be making, right? All right, so let's say we're decelerating. We let off at like 2,400 RPMs. Okay, it's basically going to keep pulling timing until it gets to a point in one of these tables that it wants to be at. What these tables do is whatever values you put in all of these tables, you're telling the car, given a certain amount of timing, an RPM value, and an air mass value, here's how much torque I should be making, right? Now, if we go into the table group up here and we switch to manifold absolute pressure, it's the same thing, but the y-axis is our manifold absolute pressure. And we don't have to do any division here. This is going to correspond exactly to the other table. Same thing. For a given amount of timing, for a given RPM, for a given manifold absolute pressure, here's how much torque we should be making. Camshaft angle. We have these tables, these air mass and map tables. And also there's E85 here. If you're running flex fuel, you're going to have to mess with the E85 tables as well. I'm not running E85 yet. I'm not running a flex fuel tune yet. So it's just air mass and map. And notice camshaft angle, we have a couple of different options here. And remember from the log, when I'm accelerating, that intake cam angle goes higher. But when I'm decelerating, it's always at 0. So I'm only going to mess with 0. Exhaust cam angle was always at 0. I'm going to set my max to 50 degrees of timing, so I get an extra table down here. And now we can begin to think about making some changes. So what we have to mess with 2 tables here. We have to mess with, for intake 0, right? For air mass and map, we have to do pretty much the same thing conceptually. Now, the car was pulling timing until it got down to about 0 degrees. I want the car to go down to about -10 degrees to make pops and bangs. So I figured for the deceleration cells only, so remember from my log, we're basically always below 0.2 cylinder air mass. So it's basically these three rows in all of these tables, right? If you use link selections, it'll select through all the tables. If you uncheck this, it'll only do 1. I know I want to just edit these 3, and what I know is that these values must be where the car is eventually settling, right? So it's saying like it's pulling timing until it hits until it hits 0 degrees, and then it stops. And what that means is for a given, let's say I'm at 0.1 cylinder air mass at 2,400 RPMs, it's saying I should be making -87 pound-feet of torque on decel, right? Now, it's not going to pull more, because if it pulled more, I'm telling it, if you go down to -10, you'll be at -122, and maybe the car doesn't want to do that, right? Driver demand is not telling the car. And I didn't mess with driver demand at all, because I didn't want to mess with like the throttle response or anything. I want the car to drive the same, right? So what I decided to do is trick the car, say, okay, well, what if at 0 degrees I told it was making that it was making more torque than it's actually making, and then at -10 I told it was making more torque only on the decel columns than it actually was making. Well, then it would keep pulling timing, right? Because it would think, oh, I'm not at my target yet. I want to make, let's say in that example I used, I want to make -87. And this is in Newton meters, so I want to make -87 Newton meters of torque, right? And I'm not there yet, so I'm just going to keep pulling time until I get there. So what I did was, for the RPM range, I wanted it to burble, which in my case I did 1,200 through 5,400. Okay, I took my 3 decel rows and I copied them and pasted them into the previous table. Now notice that changes the graph over here, and we're going to have to do some smoothing. Now I did this for every table. So I did it for all of my decel rows. Okay. And when I got to the final table, I'll show you what I did there. When I got to the final table, I realized, like, okay, for any given table, the next range is about 85% of the previous range of these negative values. So we can do a 0.85 multiply here to lower this final table, and I'll smooth that through 0.3, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, now the thing is, when you mess with these, it forces you to mess with the whole air mass range and extrapolate before you can calculate new torque coefficients. So right now, see how these graphs are a little out of whack. See how we have like some bumps in the early spots here? So what we need to do now is we need to smooth the rest of the table. Okay, see how that's smoothed out? Let me just undo that real quick so you can see the difference. Pay attention to the graphs here. See how they have this dip here? When I smooth, see how that all flattens out? You have to do that. And then you have to extrapolate your coefficients. Okay. And calculate new torque tables. Now watch what happens over here actually, we're not going to see it. Hold on. Calculate new torque tables. Now, if I go back over to torque model, notice that these tables have changed. Okay. So all these tables are for exhaust cam angle 0 degrees. The ones in red that have been changed. And notice it's only changed the row corresponding to intake cam angle equals 0. That's what I want, okay? Now, I don't know how to calculate these values appropriately myself, and I choose to do it with the virtual torque table so that I get a nice smooth range, right? You could probably mess with these manually, but I haven't tried that. If I go back into virtual torque, remember, we did that for air mass. We need to also do that for map, okay? So we're just going to do the exact same thing here for map. And you can kind of play with, if you don't want this burble to be as ridiculous, what you could do instead is take all of your tables, take the first row and just multiply it by a factor of it. Basically, we're doing a 15% change here, but maybe you only want to do a 5% change. So fine, take your first row's range, multiply it by 0.95 instead, and then smooth the rest, right? And you'll get the same effect. You just won't get as violent of a burble, which is fine. Let's do our extrapolate. Let's do our calculate. All right, now that we've modified both, we should have our final values. Notice the only values that are modified here are in the ranges that we set. So 1200 RPM to 5400 RPM, and only intake cam angle 0 because we want it only on decel. This already, as is going to pop a lot. But we didn't mess with the minimum spark table. So keep in mind, the minimum is going to provide a floor. So if we're at 4,000 RPMs, it's not going to let us go below 0. So you're not going to get street speed 717 popcorn burbles that way. So the final step here, if you want, it's totally optional, but you can play around with all of the minimum final spark rows corresponding to your decel. And how you know it's corresponding to your decel is like I showed in this log, is just pay attention to your cylinder air mass here in grams, right? So 0.12, if I go over here, 0.11. Okay, so it's pretty low usually for mine. Maybe we get some higher values. Sometimes we get some higher values. It kind of depends. I've seen it go up to like 0.2. So anyway, with that said, 0.2 would be this fourth row, right? So you play with these 4 rows, and like I said, you can raise or lower these values accordingly, and you'll get varying degrees of burbles. The more you mess with those values, even though it only goes down, the minimum virtual torque here is -10. You can actually go down to -20. And notice when I extrapolated, it uses a function, so it extrapolates indefinitely, right, throughout the entire spark range. So you can go down to -20. I didn't do that because I didn't really want the car to go much below -10. It pops a lot at -10 already. So I didn't really need to do that, but at any rate, you can go lower and mess with it if you just want it to be like cannon fire the whole time. But like I said, it kind of depends. Play with the amount. I did kind of a copy and paste because I wanted to shift. I was like, okay, every time wherever I was at 0 degrees, I wanted it to be at -10. That's why I did that copy and paste. If I didn't want to do it that way, what I would have done was I would have came in to my air mass, right, and I would have said like, okay, for each one of let's assume that these weren't already changed, right? If I just wanted to have like some very light modification, I would have just taken this first row. I would have done 0.95 x, right? So multiply by 0.95 for a negative number will raise the number, right? And then I would have just smoothed it. Honestly, I probably would have just smoothed it all the way down and just done that for air mass and map. You can do it that way. It's simpler. But in my case, I was making a pretty severe change, so I copy and pasted all the deceleration rows into the previous table because I wanted to do a full shift. I noticed that on decel, I was always hitting 0 degrees of timing. I wanted to be hitting -10. So now, if I adjust this accordingly, now you can do it really simply where you just say like, -10 equals here. You can do that. Or if you want it to kind of progress, like here, if I was at 4,000 RPMs and I let off and I start decelerating, as it transitions to diffco, I'm allowing it to pull more and more. So it'll kind of like, you'll hear it start to decel and it'll pop, like it'll start popping more and more and more. And that's kind of the effect that I wanted. So all I did here was I just shifted all of this. Instead of doing -10 or whatever equals, I just did a -5 add, so that I still have that progression moving down, but I'm just allowing it to pull a little bit more timing. Like I said, you can play with that too. Make sure whatever changes you make in a minimum spark base, you also do in the long term. They should be identical tables, but make sure that you change both of them. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So you'll have a functioning burble tune at that point. Now, there's one other component of this that you can mess with. It's totally optional. and that's deceleration fuel cutoff. What I mentioned before was torque management kicks in when you get off the gas while the car is transitioning to fuel cut. And once it transitions to fuel cut, it's not going to pop anymore because it's not fueling anymore. So you'll get a bunch of pops and cracks, and then it'll just stop, and you'll still hear yourself decelerating, right? But there won't be any more pops. If you want it to pop all the way down, you have to tell the car to continue fueling the whole way down. You will burn more fuel that way. Like your fuel economy will suffer. Not drastically, but it will suffer. And basically what you do is go into fuel, go into cutoff diffco, right? You have some parameters here. You can hard disable this by going to the enable ECT. Notice how under here it says minimum ECT to allow diffco. Above this ECT diffco will be allowed. That's in this text box down here when I hover over enable ECT. So if I just simply go in here, so it's saying, okay, diffco is allowed if my engine coolant temperature is at least 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So if I just make this something like 400, something that would be like ridiculously unsafe for my car to ever hit, diffco will never occur. And similarly with clutch fuel cutoff, I can raise all of these values so that it never cuts fuel while I'm shifting either. My car is a manual, so it has this clutch fuel cutoff. When you put the clutch down, right, it cuts fuel as you shift as well. While you're shifting, if you disable clutch fuel cutoff, you're also going to get pops. So in order to do that, this just says like for miles per hour down here, it gives you the ranges of the max value. So for miles per hour, 318 is the max. Your Corvette can't do 318. So put 318, 8,192 RPMs is the max. That would definitely do engine damage. And then, 400 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're over revving and melting our motor while going impossible speeds. So if I did all this, my car would fuel all the time. It would pop while I'm shifting. It would pop the whole way down on decel, street speed 717 style, where he's off the gas and it's just constantly popping the whole time. Total popcorn machine. I don't like that because when you are fueling on decel, you get a little bit less engine braking, and I like engine braking when I'm driving on roads like the Dragon and stuff like that. So I typically don't do this, but I figured I'd show you guys how to do it in case you were interested. And that's pretty much it. Those are the only changes you have to make. So let me bring up my final log here and just show you guys now what my log looks like when I'm let's see, accelerator pedal equals 0. Hold on, let me find a range where I'm decelerating right here, right? All right, so we're decelerating. We have no accelerator pedal, and look, now I'm hitting -10 spark. Car's popping like crazy. Pop, 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 pop. I'm actually hitting -13 there. So the changes that I made are actually pretty significant. If you determine that they're too much, you can just raise your minimum spark, but you probably would want to redo the torque model so that the car doesn't try to pull that much timing. It kind of depends what kind of response you want, right? If you set the minimums a little bit up, it'll get to that minimum faster with the changes that we just made. So it really just depends. Do you want the pops to come on really quickly or not? If you want it to kind of like ease into it, maybe make less severe changes in torque model. You're going to have to play around with these values. And remember, the absolute values are going to be different. So like in my car, right? Like notice how these top rows here, 30 degrees of timing, 40 degrees of timing, we're looking at 600 pound-feet of torque, 500 and something pound-feet of torque. That's because I have an LT4. So if you have, an LT1, like a base Stingray or like Camaro SS or something like that, all these values are going to look totally different because the expected amount of torque at these various conditions are not going to be the same as my car. You have a different motor, but the concept's the same, right? Where think of like doing everything as percentages, where you're saying like, all right, I want to say, so it thinks I'm making a certain amount at top dead center at 0 degrees of spark. I want it to think that it's making more. I want it to think it's making 15% more than it is, so that it'll pull more timing, right? So that's the concept that you have to be thinking about. It's just relative numbers. Don't worry about the absolute numbers on my particular tables. Do not copy and paste the values from my actual tables, right? Because it's going to make your car drive very wonky. So I figured out what happened in my previous video when I was just setting. So you might have the question, why can't I just go into the main spark table and just in the deceleration columns run negative timing, run -10, just target -10, right? Tell the car to do that. You can. That's what I did in the previous video, but the car drives like total shit. And the reason for that is you're telling the car, give me negative 10 degrees of timing. It gives you negative 10 degrees of timing, but then torque management is like, whoa, whoa, whoa. At negative 10 degrees, we're making, you know, even less torque than we should be making. And then it adds timing. So, so what happens is you have your target main table is actually fighting the torque management. So it's like negative 10 degrees and it's like, no, we should be at like between 0 and 5. So it adds timing. And then it's like, no, I said negative 10. So it's like negative 10, 5, negative 10, 5, negative 10, 5. And the result of that is your car is just doing this. It's just jerking around, feels like it's hesitating, feels like it's like bunny hopping. It feels terrible. The other problem with this is when you roll back onto the gas, when you're only at about like 5% throttle, because it takes a while for your cylinder air mass to build back up, that initial second or two, you're still sitting somewhere in this range. You're still below 0.2. And you're telling the car to do negative 10 degrees of timing or something, which it's trying to give you, which means it hesitates when you hit the gas. And then torque management, same thing, it's still fighting. So you're still like bucking the car and you're going nowhere. It feels like you basically have to mash the gas before it's like, okay, we have, we've cleared this region and now we're, somewhere over here or whatever. And we're not being affected anymore because we haven't, for all intents and purposes, just for demonstration purposes, right? We're sitting in here, we get back on the gas, we're still in here for a little bit, so car's still hesitating. It's not until we actually build air mass and we get out of there that, okay, now everything's back to normal because we're running the timing that we're supposed to be running. That agrees with the torque management, so the torque management's like, all right, you're good, we're not messing with you anymore. And then your car feels normal, and then rinse repeat. As soon as you get off the gas, the car starts hesitating again. So the car just drove absolutely terribly. The way I was doing it in the previous video, and I was just like, every other video I had seen was saying that's the way to implement the tune because these were on older cars that don't have a torque management system like newer cars have. So this is something that you do need to understand. There are a lot of videos online. I want to give a shout out to Goat Rope Garage. His videos helped me just understand torque management a lot. He didn't. This is in no way suggesting that he endorsed my video, but just to say that he has a lot of informative stuff on tuning in general, and he does go through torque management tuning. And basically, I learned how that system works from watching his videos. And his videos are usually, all right, you've installed headers and you've installed the cam, and you're trying to make more power, and torque management is actually holding you back because you're making more power than torque management expects you to make, so it pulls timing on you, even though you've added timing in your main tables. And I was like, that's the opposite of what's happening to me, right? I'm trying to pull timing, and torque management's like, no, and it's adding timing. So I was like, I need to do the inverse of what he's doing in some of these videos in order to adjust in my deceleration range so that I allow the car to pull more timing. The result of this, my car drives great, and it pops like a machine gun. I mean, it's ridiculous. I have to do a little more fine tuning because honestly, it's a little bit intense sometimes. Fortunately, I do have an N gauge, so I can always switch back to my previous tune that just had the minimum tables from the C6 Corvette. So if you don't want like a popcorn machine or whatever, find a car that you like the way it sounds. So like, for example, the C7 Corvettes don't really pop at all on deceleration, but the C6s do, right? That, when you put a loud exhaust on those on deceleration, they don't like pop and crack like a Burble tune, but they make like some gurgly noises. It has some character. It's not just like a totally smooth deceleration. You'll get like some very, very light pops and stuff like that. So all I did was, like I said, I just grabbed these minimum table rows from a C6 stock tune, LS3 stock tune, and just kind of threw them in here, and my car sounded like an LS3 on decel because torque management was allowing it to go, well, it was allowing it to go down to 0. So it actually wasn't, my car wasn't sounding as intense as an LS3. And I remember my old C6 with the LS2 in it. If you go back to my old videos, there's a video of me driving the Dragon in that car. That car popped pretty seriously on deceleration. I had a cam in that car. I had long tube headers, and I had a Corsa exhaust. And it wouldn't do like a popcorn machine, but it would make the occasional bang. And it would make a bunch of light pops and 1 or 2 big ones on deceleration. That's what this table kind of looks like and allowed for. So, you know, anyway, all of that just to say, that's how you mess with it. If you don't want to do such a wide RPM range like I did, like I said, I modified through 1200 to 5400. You can just only modify cells in, like, if you only wanted to do like 2000 to 4000, I would just do like 1800 to 3800 or whatever. You can mess with this. If you want it to be the whole RPM range, you can go all the way up. I didn't, but the only thing I wouldn't do, because it will affect your idle, is I didn't mess with the first 3 columns. So anything under 1000 RPMs, because that's where your car is going to idle at. My car idles at about 650 RPMs, but I know I'm going to have to raise that a little bit when I put a cam in it. So I didn't mess with those tables at all, because I didn't want it to be like running less timing and kind of having like a rough idle or anything like that. So I wouldn't mess with those. I went down to 1200 because that's the lowest amount I felt that I could go where, you know, it wouldn't affect the idle at all. But if you don't want it popping all the way down, like under 2000 RPMs, like if you only want it doing it when you're on the gas and stuff like that, you can do 3000 and up. You can kind of do whatever range you want, whatever you feel comfortable with, basically. So yeah, anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. I know this is a pretty long and in-depth video, but it took me a really long time to figure this out, and I was perusing the HP Tuners forums and watching a ton of YouTube videos of tuners and just kind of learning how all this stuff works. And I haven't found a good video that explains how to do this for the purpose of like Burble tuning. And I know all of the tuners out there. I had actually emailed a few places. I'm not going to name names, but I emailed a few places that are known for these sorts of tunes, and none of them got back to me with, you know, I was just asking, like, conceptually, how do you do this? I'm not asking you to provide me a file or anything like that. I'm not going to copy and paste your tune. I just want to know, like, am I going about this right? Which I found out in the end I was not going about it correctly. And no one responded to me. They don't want to give away their secrets. And, you know, I just feel like this is something where you're just pulling timing. It's just for show. It's not something super complicated. But anyway, none of them got back to me. So I just went about figuring it out on my own. It took me a really long time to figure it out. So I know this video is pretty in depth and super long, but I just wanted to, you know, give you guys the full tutorial for anyone who's interested. So anyway, I really hope this helps any of you. I hope this all makes sense. And let me know what you guys think in the comments. That's ridiculous. That's insane.